For decades, drivers on a dark stretch of Chicago's Archer Avenue have encountered the same eerie vision. A young woman in white, thumbing for a ride, only to vanish near Resurrection Cemetery. Who is she, or who was she? And why won't her ghost let go?
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
It begins with a lone figure on the roadside. Pale, silent, and dressed in white. Dozens of witnesses have seen her over the years, always on Archer Avenue, always near Resurrection Cemetery. Some say she's a spirit of the past. Others claim she's still looking for a way home. Tonight, we follow the trail of Resurrection Mary, Chicago's vanishing hitchhiker, and the legends, the lives, and the losses she may have left behind. Make sure you're subscribed as we dive deep into this campfire legend after this. It's a moonless night on Archer Avenue, a lonely stretch of road southwest of Chicago. A driver rounds a curve by Resurrection Cemetery, headlights cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, a young woman steps out of the shadows. She's beautiful, eerily pale, dressed in a white party dress. She raises her thumb for a ride. The startled driver pulls over. The woman wordlessly slips into the back seat, shivering without a coat in the chill air. She directs him up Archer Avenue, and the driver obliges, glancing at his silent passenger in the rearview mirror. As they near the cemetery gates, the mysterious girl jolts upright and cries out, "Here! Stop here!" Confused, the driver looks around at the roadside tombstones. In that split second, the girl vanishes from the back seat. No trace left behind. The car door had never opened. Such is the classic encounter with Resurrection Mary, the legendary ghostly hitchhiker of Chicago's South Side. For nearly a century, locals have whispered about this vanishing hitchhiker in a white gown who prowls Archer Avenue, thumbing rides only to disappear at Resurrection Cemetery's gates. She has been called Chicago's most famous ghost story, and she has become an inescapable part of local folklore. But where did this legend begin, and what truth, if any, lies behind the ghost stories? We are going to delve into the creepy origins and evolution of the Resurrection Mary legend, examine documented sightings and encounters over the decades, and explore attempts to identify a real person behind the phantom. We'll also take a look at local history surrounding Resurrection Cemetery, the role of folklore and the media in spreading Mary's tale, and her lasting impact on popular culture, as well as Chicago tourism. Along the way, we'll separate verified facts from spooky fiction, clearly noting where the story slides into urban legend. So prepare yourself for a dramatic yet fact-grounded journey through one of America's greatest ghost stories, one that continues to beguile and unnerve to this very day. The legend of Resurrection Mary has its roots in the Jazz Age, with a backstory set in the roaring 1920s or early 1930s. According to popular lore, a young woman named Mary spent an evening dancing at a ballroom on Archer Avenue. Different tellings name the venue as the O. Henry Ballroom in Willow Springs, later renamed the Willowbrook Ballroom. Mary was out for a night of swing dancing with her boyfriend. At some point, the couple quarreled. In a fit of temper, Mary stormed out of the ballroom into the cold night, still clad in her white dancing dress and shoes. Angry and likely heartbroken, Mary set off on foot along Archer Avenue, intending to walk home. Tragedy struck on the roadside. A car came barreling down the dark highway and struck Mary as she walked. The driver, so the story goes, fled the scene, leaving the young woman to die from her injuries. Mary's grief-stricken parents later found her body and laid her to rest in nearby Resurrection Cemetery, buried in her beloved white gown and dancing shoes. The hit-and-run culprit was never identified. It's a heartbreaking tale, and notably, no historical record has ever confirmed this exact series of events. There is no definitive police report or news item from the era about a young woman named Mary killed by a hit and run on Archer Avenue after leaving a dance. Rather, this backstory appears to be an early piece of folklore, possibly intended to give context to later ghost sightings. In other words, the ballroom argument and fatal accident narrative is treated as legend, not verified fact. It provides a kind of origin myth for Resurrection Mary, explaining why her ghost might haunt that road, a young life cut short on the way home from a dance, a spirit still searching for a ride back home, or back to her grave. What we do know is that by the late 1930s, stories of a vanishing hitchhiker on Archer Avenue were already circulating around Chicago's South Side. The trope of the ghostly hitchhiker was not unique to Chicago. Folklorists have documented similar tales worldwide, often referred to simply as vanishing hitchhiker legends, dating back decades or even centuries. A seminal 1942 study in the California Folklore Quarterly found multiple hitchhiker ghost stories across the United States with common elements. A traveler late at night gives a ride to a strange woman, often young and dressed in white, who later vanishes without explanation. In some variations, the mysterious passenger gives an address that turns out to be a cemetery, or claims to be returning from a dance or event. Clearly, the Resurrection Mary story is Chicago's distinctive spin on this broader urban legend motif. However, what makes Mary's case unusual is the sheer number of first-hand accounts over the years. From the very beginning, Resurrection Mary's story straddled the line between folklore and actual belief. In the tightly knit ethnic neighborhoods of Chicago's Southwest Side, places like Archer Heights, Brighton Park, and Justice, Illinois, residents swapped stories about encounters with a pale blonde girl in a white dress hitchhiking near Resurrection Cemetery. These early tales were shared person to person, part of the oral lore of the community. As one paranormal investigator, Dale Kaczmarek, later noted, even his parents, who dated in the late 1930s, had heard the story back then. His father would teasingly drive past Resurrection Cemetery after their dates, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghost, to the chagrin of Kaczmarek's mother. That implies the legend was already alive shortly after the supposed time of Mary's death. It wasn't until decades later that researchers and journalists began writing down the Resurrection Mary story, trying to piece together its origin. When they did, some dug into local archives for real-life incidents that might match the legend's outline. This quest led to a few tantalizing historical candidates, but we'll get to those in just a little bit. But it bears repeating. The classic origin tale of Resurrection Mary, the fight, the roadside fatality, remains unverified. It is an archetypal ghost story, one that makes poetic sense even if it lacks documentation. It sets the stage for many ghostly encounters to come, providing a tragic figure we can imagine wandering Archer Avenue, caught between the dance and the grave. The earliest well-known Resurrection Mary encounter dates to 1939, about 10 years after the legend's supposed starting point. A 22-year-old Southside man named Jerry Palus claimed he had a face-to-face dance with the ghost. His story, often retold by ghost researchers and even featured on television, unfolds like a scene from a kind of paranormal romance. According to Palus, it was a cold autumn night in 1939, and he was out at a local dance hall called the Liberty Grove and Hall in Chicago's Brighton Park neighborhood. During the night, Jerry's eyes were drawn to a quiet young woman he hadn't seen there before. A lovely blonde girl, around 5'7", wearing a white formal dress that was fashionably a bit old-fashioned. She introduced herself only as Mary. The two danced together most of the night to the live band's music. Jerry noticed something odd, though. Mary's hands felt as cold as ice, but he brushed it off, joking that, quote, she must have a warm heart to compensate. Some versions of the story even say Jerry sneaked a kiss from the mysterious girl during a slow dance. When the night grew late and the ballroom prepared to close, Jerry offered Mary a ride home. She accepted. Mary had told Jerry she lived on the south side, specifically on South Damon Avenue, in the back of the Yards neighborhood. But curiously, once in Jerry's car, she insisted he drive her down Archer Avenue instead. Jerry was puzzled. Archer Avenue wouldn't lead directly to her stated home, but Mary was adamant about that route. So they headed down Archer through the quiet, darkened outskirts. As they approached the gates of Resurrection Cemetery in the nearby suburb of Justice, Mary suddenly grew agitated and told Jerry to stop the car. "Let me out here," she said, even though they were in front of the cemetery with no house in sight. Jerry offered to walk her to wherever she was going, concerned for a young woman wandering alone at night. But Mary replied in a strange, somber tone. "Where I'm going, you can't follow." Then she exited the car and walked toward the cemetery gates. Before Jerry's astonished eyes, the girl faded into thin air, disappearing in front of the locked cemetery entrance. In that moment, Jerry later recounted, he realized something was very wrong. The beautiful blonde he had spent the evening with was no ordinary girl. She was, he believed, a ghost. Shaken but curious, Jerry Palus did some investigating of his own the next day. He remembered Mary's address on Damon Avenue that she had given him during their chat. That morning, Jerry drove to the house. A middle-aged woman answered the door, Mary's mother, as it turned out. When Jerry asked if Mary was home, the woman sadly informed him that her daughter Mary had been dead for several years. Jerry glimpsed a photo over the woman's shoulder in the parlor, a framed portrait of the same girl he'd danced with the night before. The mother explained that the girl in the photo was indeed her daughter Mary, who died 5 years ago. At this revelation, Jerry felt chills. He later told a folklorist friend that it finally clicked why Mary's hands had been so icy. Jerry had once worked briefly in a funeral home. The cold touch of her skin reminded him of a corpse's cold flesh. In other words, Jerry became convinced that he had spent an entire evening dancing with a dead woman's ghost. This dramatic story has become Resurrection Mary's equivalent of an origin encounter, the first and perhaps most famous eyewitness account. It has been retold in countless books and television programs, including a 1990s episode of Unsolved Mysteries, where an older Jerry Palus recounted the tale on camera. However, it is important to note that Jerry Palus's testimony is anecdotal. There is no newspaper from 1939 that documented a man dancing with a ghost. Palus only went public with his experience decades later. He gave a videotaped interview in 1986, shortly before his death, which aired on Unsolved Mysteries in 1994. So, while his story is a cornerstone of the legend, and Palus himself apparently remained adamant about what had happened, it cannot be independently verified. It lives on as a piece of oral history, passed from the witness to the public via storytellers. Interestingly, local researchers have pointed out that Palus's encounter was unusually intimate for a ghost sighting. He spent hours with Mary, dancing, conversing, even kissing, whereas most Resurrection Mary reports are far more fleeting and less personal. In the spectrum of ghost stories, Jerry Palus's tale is exceptional. If true, it suggests Mary's spirit was capable of substantial interaction, appearing solid enough to dance and speak, not just a momentary boo apparition. Skeptics, of course, might counter-argue that such an extraordinary claim demands better evidence than one man's memory told years after the fact. We must label the Palus story as legend mixed with eyewitness testimony, a compelling anecdote with no proof beyond the storyteller's word. Yet Jerry Palus was hardly the last person to claim a brush with Resurrection Mary. In the decades that followed, more and more locals would step forward with eerily similar accounts. By the 1970s, the legend entered a new, highly public phase, fueled by media attention and a flurry of reported sightings. After World War II, through the 1950s and 60s, Resurrection Mary seemed to lurk in the shadows of folklore, well known around Chicago's South Side, but not much reported in the press. That changed in the 1970s, when a series of encounters propelled Mary from local lore into citywide, even national awareness. It was during this era that journalists, ghost hunters, and ordinary citizens all converged on the mystery of the hitchhiking girl in white. Some of the best-known Resurrection Mary stories date from the 1970s and early 1980s, and unlike earlier tales, a few of these made it into newspapers or were corroborated by multiple witnesses. We'll examine the most notable cases, pointing out where documentation exists and where we're dealing purely with story. One pivotal account came from January 1979, when a Chicago cab driver, known only as Ralph, had a frightening experience on Archer Avenue. Ralph's story was compelling enough that it was written up by respected journalist Bill Geist, then a columnist for the Suburban Trib, a Chicago Tribune suburban edition. Geist's January 31, 1979 column, titled "Cryptic Rider Leaves Taxi Driver with the Willies," introduced a broad audience to the legend and gave it a veneer of credibility by appearing in newsprint. According to Geist's piece, which presented Ralph's account in the cabbie's own words, Ralph was driving his taxi along Archer Avenue late one snowy night when he spotted a young blonde woman in a white dress with no coat, looking for a ride. He picked her up and noticed she was quiet and fuzzy, perhaps dazed or tired, speaking little besides remarking, "The snow came early this year," while gazing out the window. She gave him an address, but then suddenly demanded he stop the car right in front of Resurrection Cemetery, even though there were no houses around. Puzzled, Ralph looked away for a moment, and when he turned back, his passenger had vanished from the back seat. Just like before, the taxi door hadn't opened. The girl was simply gone. Ralph was so unnerved that he actually went into a nearby tavern, Chet's Melody Lounge, across from the cemetery, to ask if anyone had seen the girl who skipped out on her fare. By the time he spoke with Bill Geist, Ralph refused to give his last name, fearing ridicule. But Geist described him as a thoroughly level-headed, no-nonsense, working-class guy, a church-going Little League coach, not someone prone to fanciful tales. Geist gently informed the shaken cabbie that he had likely given Resurrection Mary a lift, to the cab driver's great astonishment. The columnist made it clear he found Ralph to be credible, noting the story was far too outlandish for a man like him to invent just to get his name in the paper. This 1979 taxi driver incident is significant for a few reasons. First, it appeared in a major newspaper, essentially bringing Resurrection Mary into the mainstream. Second, Ralph's experience closely paralleled earlier stories. A young woman in white, hitchhiking, disappearing at the cemetery, showing how consistent the legend's pattern was. And third, Geist's reporting lent weight to the idea that many witnesses were remarkably level-headed people, not prone to hallucinations, as local folklorist Richard Crow observed. Indeed, folklorist Richard T. Crow himself had begun collecting Resurrection Mary reports by the 1970s and would claim he had gathered 36 substantiated encounters from the 1930s onward. Crow often noted that many witnesses were ordinary Chicagoans, cabbies, police officers, clubgoers, who didn't even realize they'd seen a famous ghost until afterward. This, he argued, made the case more compelling than a typical urban legend that's always sourced from a friend of a friend. Mary's witnesses often came forward independently, with similar stories, not knowing of each other's accounts, which paranormal researchers took as a sign that something was happening on Archer Avenue, beyond simply folklore. Beyond the famous cab driver story, the 1970s yielded other sightings that became part of Resurrection Mary's lore. In 1973, at a nightclub called Harlow's on Chicago's southwest side, patrons reported an encounter with an oddly out-of-place young woman, matching Mary's description. The night manager, Bob Main, later told the Chicago Tribune that twice that year he saw a peculiar blonde woman in an old-fashioned white dress inside Harlow's. She would dance alone, twirling in a corner near the dance floor, and wouldn't speak to anyone. She had a very pale complexion, big spoolie curls in her hair, and most disturbingly of all, Maine recalled that she looked as if she was bleeding from one eye. Other clubgoers whispered about how bizarre the girl was, and no one saw her enter or leave. She was just suddenly there, and later, gone. Maine's description, given in a 1992 Tribune interview, strongly evoked the image of Mary's ghost. If true, it suggests Mary was not confined to hitchhiking. She might wander into a nightclub occasionally, perhaps drawn to the music and dancing she had enjoyed in life. Of course, this too is anecdotal. There's no proof the bleeding-eyed girl wasn't just an oddly dressed patron in need of medical attention. But for believers, Bob Main's story showed Mary's continuing presence in the area's nightlife. Arguably, the most dramatic physical evidence tied to Resurrection Mary also dates to the 1970s. On August 10th, 1976, something uncanny was found at Resurrection Cemetery's gate. A passerby that night called police after seeing what he thought was a young woman locked inside the cemetery, grasping the iron bars as if trying to get out. Authorities arrived and found no woman. The graveyard was empty. But they did find that 2 of the tall wrought iron bars on the gate were bent apart at roughly hand height, with what looked like the impressions of slender handprints into the green painted metal. The bars had been wrenched apart as though some terrific force had pushed them from inside. Moreover, the metal showed scorch marks and the texture of skin, as if a ghostly hand had burned itself into the iron. This spine-chilling discovery immediately fueled speculation that Resurrection Mary had physically interacted with the gate in an attempt to flag down help, literally leaving her fingerprints behind. Not everyone accepted that supernatural explanation. Cemetery officials quickly offered a mundane account, claiming that a truck had accidentally backed into the gate and bent the bars, and that the handprints were from a repair worker who tried to straighten them out. They said perhaps a welder's hands or gloves left marks when the heat was applied to fix the iron. However, many were unconvinced. Paranormal investigator Dale Kazmarek pointed out the scorch marks didn't resemble typical welding patterns, and argued that a worker would have worn heavy gloves anyway, making defined handprints unlikely. For years, the burned-on handprints remained visible on the bent bars, despite the cemetery painting over them repeatedly. The outline of slender fingers still peeked through. The site became a magnet for legend trippers. Curious locals drove by at night, hoping to spot the glowing ghost and her infamous handiwork on the gate. Eventually, annoyed by the attention, the church caretakers removed the bent sections of the bars entirely, reportedly around 2019 through 2022, decades later. Today, there's a gap in the fence where the haunted bars once stood. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw a peak in Resurrection Mary encounters. Besides the 1976 gate incident, there were numerous reported sightings in 1978, 1979, 1980, and 1989, essentially one or two per year, making the rounds in local lore. Many followed familiar patterns, drivers almost hitting a running girl, who then vanished, or passers-by seeing a lone figure matching Mary's description, walking by the cemetery before disappearing. Two cases are especially well known. In 1980, a young couple named Claire and Mark Rudnicki were driving along Archer Avenue past Resurrection Cemetery when Claire suddenly saw a figure on the roadside. It was a girl in a white dress, bathed in a strange, pale light, walking slowly along the shoulder. Claire immediately thought of Resurrection Mary and felt her stomach lurch with fear. Her husband, Mark, also caught a glimpse and decided to turn the car around for another look, despite Claire's protests. As they passed the spot again, the glowing girl had vanished completely. In recounting the incident on Unsolved Mysteries, Mark Rudnicki added an extra chilling detail. As they drove past the first time, he peered at the girl's face and saw a black void. No discernible facial features at all. It was as if they had seen a figure that wasn't fully human. Both Rudnickis were left deeply rattled, and their story reinforced the idea that Mary prowled that stretch of road looking for would-be rescuers. In October 1989, Janet Kalal, in her late 20s, was out for a drive with a friend near Resurrection Cemetery when they experienced what many regard as Mary's last major appearance to date. As Janet drove down Archer, a young woman in a white gown sprinted on the road directly in front of the car. Janet had no time to brake. She hit the figure head on, or so she thought. There was no impact, no thud, no damage. Panicked, Janet and her friend jumped out, expecting the worst, but found nothing at all on the roadway. No injured woman, no body, just the silent cemetery looming nearby. Janet's friend, Pamela, later recalled that her own father had read about Resurrection Mary back in 1939, and she never imagined she'd become part of the story herself decades later. The Kalal incident, widely publicized through television, newspapers, and magazines, further cemented Mary's legacy. It had the hallmarks of a classic ghostly woman runs in front of a car apparition, a scenario reported in other haunting cases worldwide. Fortunately for Janet, she emerged only shaken, not physically harmed. A reminder that Mary, whatever she is, does not seem to wish actual harm on people, only to give them a fright, perhaps inadvertently. By the end of the 1980s, Resurrection Mary had been featured in newspaper articles, television newscasts, and even went national when appearing in 1994 on Unsolved Mysteries. The ghost had effectively gone mainstream. Some longtime Chicagoans noted with a wink that Mary was old hat by then, a well-worn story. But each new retelling brought fresh eyes to the legend. Notably, Richard Crowe, the folklorist who pioneered Chicago ghost tours, often offered a free steak dinner to anyone who could bring him definitive proof of Mary's existence. He never had to pay up for proof, but he did get plenty of people coming forward with stories. By the 1980s, Mary had evolved from a local curiosity into a full-fledged piece of Chicagoland mythology, with a sizable file of sightings and a reputation that extended far beyond the city. It's important to emphasize that despite the volume of accounts, none of these accounts can be verified scientifically. We have names, dates, and some newspaper documentation for a few cases, like Bill Geist's 1979 column or the Tribune's 1992 interview with Bob Mayne, etc. But we do not have physical proof of the supernatural. Only testimonies and circumstantial oddities. The bent gate was a physical artifact, yes, but even that had a plausible, non-ghost explanation. So, while our narrative has treated these sightings seriously and in detail, they remain anecdotal evidence of a phenomena. The consistent pattern is intriguing and hard to ignore. Too many independent witnesses over too many years, proponents say, for it to all be pure invention. But skeptics counter that human perception and memory are fallible, and urban legends have a way of feeding themselves. Resurrection Mary lives at the intersection of belief and doubt, where multiple eyewitness stories give life to a character that official history struggles to confirm. As Resurrection Mary's fame grew, so grew an obvious question. If this ghost is real, who is she? Ghost stories often spawn origin theories, tying the phantom to a specific deceased person. In Mary's case, researchers have pored over cemetery records, newspaper archives, and death certificates, hunting for a young woman who might be the restless soul in question. This detective work has yielded a few leading candidates, each with intriguing connections to the legend, and each with certain discrepancies. Let's examine the main contenders and the evidence, or lack thereof, for each. We will clearly distinguish documented facts about these historical figures from the speculation that links them to Resurrection Mary. For decades, the prime suspect in Resurrection Mary's identity was a 21-year-old woman named Mary, or Marie, Bregovy. Mary Bregovy was a real person, a beautiful young Polish American who lived in Chicago's Back of the Yards neighborhood in the early 1930s. Her name began to surface in connection with the ghost story in the 1970s, and by the 1980s, many assumed Resurrection Mary must be Mary Bregovy's ghost. So what do we know about Mary Bregovy's life and death? Bregovy's tragic end was recorded in the Chicago Tribune on March 12, 1934. The news item reported that Marie Bregovy, age 21, was killed in an automobile wreck the previous night. The accident did not occur on Archer Avenue, nor even in the southwest suburbs. It happened in the downtown Chicago Loop. Bregovy was a passenger in a car that cracked up at the intersection of Lake Street and Wacker Drive after the driver missed seeing an elevated train trestle. The Tribune noted that corner was, quote, known to police as a dangerous spot due to such collisions. In the car with Mary Bregovy were 2 young men and another young woman, all of whom survived. The driver, John Thowell, later said he hadn't seen the L structure in time. Mary, sadly, bore the brunt of the crash and was killed instantly. The facts of Bregovy's death show some initial inconsistencies with the ghost story. She died in the city, nowhere near Resurrection Cemetery. She was in a car with friends, not walking alone from a dance. And her death was due to a collision with infrastructure, not a hit-and-run driver. So, why do researchers think she could be Resurrection Mary? The answer lies in the web of personal details that link her to elements of the legend. Mary Bregovy lived at 4611 South Damon Avenue, according to the Tribune. If you recall from earlier, in Jerry Palus's story, Mary claimed to live on Damon Avenue. Jerry later went to an address on South Damon where the mother supposedly said Mary was dead. Bregovy's residence on the same street as the ghost's purported home is a striking coincidence. In fact, a friend of Bregovy's later confirmed that Bregovy's wake was held at a funeral home just blocks from that address, the Satala Funeral Home on Damon Avenue, and that Bregovy was indeed buried wearing a fancy dress. described as an orchid-colored gown. Speaking of dresses, one eerie tale reported by author Troy Taylor holds that shortly after Bregovy's funeral in 1934, a cemetery caretaker spotted a young woman in an orchid-colored dress wandering Resurrection Cemetery at night. The caretaker mentioned it to the funeral director, who supposedly remarked that the description matched Mary Bregovy in her burial dress. Other reports around that same time, the spring of 1934, claimed a ghostly woman in a light-colored dress was seen jumping onto the running boards of passing cars near the cemetery. These ghostly sightings so soon after Bregovy's death certainly align with the notion that her spirit might be Resurrection Mary, at least in the immediate aftermath. Mary Bregovy loved dancing, according to her friends. One friend, Laverne Rutkowski, gave an interview in 1984, shedding light on Mary's final day. Rutkowski recounted that on March 10, 1934, she and Mary Bregovy spent the day shopping on 47th Street. They met two young men who drove recklessly around the neighborhood. Rutkowski got a bad feeling and insisted on leaving the car, but Mary Bregovy was smitten enough to go out with those wild boys that night, despite her parents' objections. Family lore, filtered through later storytellers, suggested that Bregovy and these new friends might have gone dancing at the O. Henry Ballroom in Willow Springs earlier that evening, before ending up downtown, where the crash occurred. There's no direct evidence they truly went to the Willowbrook O. Henry that night. However, the notion that Mary Bregovy might have been ballroom hopping with two young men helps reconcile why she died so far from home. One theory says the group left the early closing suburban ballroom to seek another dance hall in the city that stayed open later. If that is true, then Mary Bregovy did spend her last hours dancing, just like the legend's Phantom Mary. In a poignant twist of fate, the Tribune obituary shows that Mary Bregovy died just a month shy of her 21st birthday. She was on the cusp of adulthood, in the prime of youth, when her life was cut short. This fits the profile of a restless spirit often attributed to ghosts. A young person who died unexpectedly and perhaps harbors unfinished business or longing, leading to a haunting. The final piece worth noting is Mary Bregovy's physical appearance. Photographs, like one family photo that has managed to circulate, show Mary Bregovy with dark hair, a brunette. Yet, Resurrection Mary is usually described as a blonde or light-haired spirit. This discrepancy has given some researchers pause. Could a ghost change hair color, or did witness recollections simply get the shade wrong in the dim light? Also, Bregovy's first name was technically Marie, though she often went by Mary. It's a minor difference, but to folklorists, such inconsistencies stand out as hints that Bregovy might not perfectly fit the legend's details. For a long time, Mary Bregovy was the leading theory, so much so that many articles and books casually stated that Resurrection Mary was Mary Bregovy's ghost. However, over the years, doubts have risen. Critics point out that a loop car crash doesn't match the Archer Avenue roadside death scenario at all, making it a stretch to connect Bregovy to the hitchhiker tale without considerable embellishment. Some suspect that Bregovy's story was shoehorned into the legend retroactively after the fact because her death roughly coincided with the right era and she was indeed buried in Resurrection Cemetery, though even that has a caveat. Bregovy's family may have initially interred her in a temporary grave at Resurrection that was later moved. In summary, Mary Bregovy's life and death share enough touch points with the myth: the love of dancing, the South Side address, the sudden, tragic end. It's easy to imagine her spirit roaming Archer Avenue. Yet significant differences, location of death, hair color, prevent us from calling it a perfect match. The jury remains out. Mary Bregovy is a strong candidate, but not a confirmed identity for the ghost. Another compelling contender emerged in the 1990s, thanks largely to the research of Chicago ghost historian Ursula Bielski. Bielski documented the story of Anna Maria Norkus, a girl whose fate in 1927 uncannily parallels parts of the Resurrection Mary legend. Anna Norkus, often called Maria in Lithuanian Polish style, was even younger than Mary Bregovy, just 12 years old. But the circumstances of her death make her a fascinating possibility. On July 20th, 1927, Anna Norkus's father, August Norkus, took her out for a special night. Anna was approaching her 13th birthday, and by some accounts, she loved to dance. Despite her being underage, August agreed to take Anna to the O. Henry Ballroom in Willow Springs for an evening of music, possibly as a birthday treat. They were accompanied by a friend, William, and also had a couple of other youngsters in the car. In the early hours of July 21st, as the group was driving home, tragedy struck on a road not far from the ballroom. Their car swerved off Harlem Avenue near 66th Street, just a few miles from Resurrection Cemetery, and plunged into a deep ditch or railroad cut. The vehicle flipped over, and young Anna Norkus was crushed beneath it, dying almost instantly. One older man in the car also died of injuries, while several others, including Anna's father and sister, survived with injuries. This accident was reported in the newspapers at the time, a real event that left a real family grieving. Now consider how Anna Norkus's story lines up with Resurrection Mary. Anna was coming home from the O. Henry Ballroom, the very dance hall immortalized in Mary's origin legend. Unlike Bregovy's case, here we have documented proof of a young girl actually returning from that ballroom on the night she died. This directly ties a ballroom outing to a fatal accident near Archer Avenue. Anna Norkus was blonde. Photographs and descriptions confirm she had light hair. This matches the classic description of the ghostly Mary as a fair-haired girl in a white dress. Bregovy, by contrast, was brunette, which some saw as a strike against her being the ghost. Anna's physical appearance, young, blonde, fond of dancing, is more consistent with the ghost story details. The Norkus accident occurred in 1927, a bit earlier than Mary's supposed death in the early 1930s, as legend suggests. However, it falls within a plausible range, especially if one considers that an urban legend's timeline can be fuzzy. By the time Jerry Palus met Mary in 1939, Anna would have been dead for 12 years, which is roughly the 5 years dead figure Palus heard, perhaps misremembered or stylized in retellings. If Jerry misheard, or if storytellers embellished the timeline, it's conceivable that Anna Norkus could have been dead for years by the late 1930s, and thus a candidate for the ghost Jerry encountered. Though there is one sticking point. Anna Norkus was only 12 years old. Every Resurrection Mary witness consistently describes a young woman or late teen girl, not a child. Mary appears as someone in her late teens or early 20s and age appropriate for dancing and attending nightclubs. Anna at 12 years old seems too young to fit that image. Bielski and others have speculated that perhaps the ghost appears older than Anna's actual age, or that maybe Anna had a slightly older look. Another possibility floated is that Anna's spirit aged in some way to the young woman she would have become, which enters very speculative territory, though when it comes to ghosts, speculation is king. In any case, the age mismatch is a notable issue with the Anna theory. However, there's also the questions raised by her burial. Anna Norkus was slated to be buried at St. Casimir Cemetery, a Lithuanian Catholic cemetery in Chicago's Mount Greenwood area, not Resurrection Cemetery. However, Bielski uncovered a tantalizing anecdote. Due to a gravedigger's strike at the time of Anna's death, the family allegedly couldn't bury her immediately at St. Casimir. There is a claim, though not confirmed by official records, that Anna's body was temporarily interred at Resurrection Cemetery until the strike ended. Then her remains were moved to St. Casimir. But possibly some mix-up occurred. The theory is that if Anna's coffin spent time at Resurrection, or if any part of her remained there, her spirit might linger at Resurrection's grounds. This is admittedly a stretch, but local ghost lore often seizes on such quirks to explain hauntings. In 1999, Ursula Bielski published her research proposing Anna Norkus as a strong candidate for Resurrection Mary. Her work convinced many in the paranormal community. Even the owners of the Willowbrook Ballroom came to believe in Anna's connection. The late owner, Beirut, kept a copy of Anna Norkus's death certificate on the ballroom's office wall as a nod to Mary's likely identity. This was reported in a daily Southtown feature in 2016, the same year the historic Willowbrook Ballroom tragically burned down, ending an era. In the aftermath of the fire, there was an emotional outpouring from locals. Notably, someone hung a pair of white dancing shoes on the charred ruins with a sign, "Please rebuild the ballroom." Signed, Resurrection Mary. The very people who ran and loved that ballroom tacitly acknowledged Anna and Mary as part of its legacy. Despite the compelling alignment of Anna Norkus's story, skeptics point out the age issue and the lack of clear documentation of her supposed burial at resurrection. No official record confirms that her body was ever there. It's more an oral history claim. And believers counter skeptics by saying, perhaps Resurrection Mary is not tied to a single person at all. Beyond Bregovy and Norkus, various other names have been floated over the years, forming a sort of who's who of potential Marys. Each theory attempts to fill gaps in the others, but many of these fall apart under scrutiny. Here are a few notable ones. A story circulated that a young woman named Mary Miskowski, who lived near 47th Street and Damon, again, that back of the yards area, was killed by a hit-and-run driver around Halloween 1930 while on her way to a costume ball. In this version, Mary Miskowski was supposedly wearing her mother's old wedding dress as a costume, hence a young woman in a white dress killed by a car. Very much Resurrection Mary's profile. The tantalizing details included blonde hair, a love for dancing, a death on Halloween, and living on the same street as Mary Bregovy. It sounds almost too perfect, and indeed, researcher Adam Selzer dug into public records and found no evidence of any Mary Miskowski dying in 1930 in Chicago. He did, however, find a Mary Miskowski at the address in question, but she lived a full life, married, had children, and died in 1956. In short, the Mary Miskowski tale appears to be just an oral legend or a misremembered identity, not a real person who died as described. Another South Side woman named Mary Kovac has been proposed. Mary Kovac, like Bregovy and Miskowski, lived on Damon Avenue. She was known to be a fashionable dresser, a regular at local dance halls, and she had blonde hair, checking many boxes of our ghost. However, Mary Kovac died in 1932 of tuberculosis, not an accident. The idea here, raised in a podcast called The Epitaph, is that perhaps her ghost loved dancing so much that it hitched a ride back to the ballroom, even after death. Of course, that's highly speculative and deviates from the core hit-by-car legend, but it shows how virtually any young blonde Mary from the area who died in the 1920s or 30s becomes a candidate. It's possible that all of the above hold some truth. Ghost tour guides like Richard Crow and authors like Troy Taylor have mused that maybe the reason the sightings don't all perfectly match one person is because more than one spirit is active on Archer Avenue, and over times, their stories merged. For example, perhaps Mary Bregovy's ghost did appear early on with her orchid dress around Resurrection Cemetery, and later Anna Norkus's spirit also roamed Archer after her accident, and the two narratives blended into one Resurrection Mary legend. Or maybe none of the specific names are exactly right, and Mary is a composite of many restless souls. The cemetery, after all, holds over 150,000 graves. Countless young women are buried there, some of whom surely died tragically. A folklorist might say Resurrection Mary is an archetype, the collective manifestation of several stories about lives cut short, distilled into one iconic ghost. Despite decades of amateur sleuthing, no consensus has been reached on Mary's true identity. The cemetery itself, according to a comment recounted on the Unsolved Mysteries website, once narrowed it down to 5 possible young ladies who fit the legend's time frame and profile. That might be folklore in itself, but it underscores the lingering curiosity. Officially, there is no grave marker labeled Resurrection Mary. She remains an enigma. Each candidate, Bregovy, Norkus, or others, carries both alluring connections as well as problematic details. The exercise of matching Mary to a real-life person is part fact-finding and part folklore unto itself. We have verified facts about certain deaths, like Bregovy's in 1934 or Norkus's in 1927. Those are real. The notion that any one of those is the ghost is speculative. It's a human need to put a name and face to the unknown. In Mary's case, that need has kept historians and ghost hunters busy for ages. But the mystery endures. Perhaps that is a key to her legend's longevity. She could be anyone, and thus she belongs to everyone. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, it's undeniable that Resurrection Mary has been kept alive by storytelling. This is a legend shaped by oral tradition, embellished by media, and reinforced by each new generation's retelling. So now let's explore how folklore and media intersect in Mary's tale, and how Chicago's own cultural landscape provided fertile ground for a ghost story to thrive. Scholars of folklore would classify Resurrection Mary under the wide umbrella of the vanishing hitchhiker urban legend. As noted earlier, researchers Beardsley and Hankey famously cataloged dozens of such hitchhiker tales in the 1940s, finding striking commonalities from California to New York. The core elements, a mysterious rider, a request to be let out by a cemetery, a subsequent disappearance, repeat across many localities. Mary's story hits every beat of the classic motif, except, many argue, it has more specificity and corroboration than most. Typically, vanishing hitchhiker stories are true urban legends in the folkloric sense. They happen to a friend of a friend and lack identifying details. They're often dismissed as just spooky fiction, but Resurrection Mary stands out because so many accounts are first person or close to it, complete with names, dates, and locations. Instead of, "My cousin's friend once picked up a ghost," we have named individuals, Paulus, Callel, Ralph the Cabbie, etc., telling their very own stories. This gives Mary's legend a patina of authenticity that pure folklore generally lacks. Folklorist and tour guide Richard T. Crow often championed Mary's credibility on this basis. He said, quote, "Of all the ghost stories worth believing in, Resurrection Mary is the one with the best documentation." Crow collected affidavits and interviews, amassing what he claimed were dozens of reliable witness reports over the years. He emphasized that these witnesses were usually normal, sober people with no prior paranormal claims. In other words, not attention seekers or kooks. Crow's efforts in the 1970s, including organizing Chicago's first ghost tours, did a great deal to spread Resurrection Mary's fame. He would regale busloads of tour takers with the tale, even driving them down Archer Avenue in the dead of night. This helped transition Mary from a niche local spook story into a must-hear Chicago attraction. One could say Crow turned Mary into a pillar of Chicago's ghost lore, inspiring subsequent authors and researchers to dig deeper. The media also played a pivotal role. We've mentioned Bill Geist's 1979 column and the Tribune's 1980s coverage. Additionally, around Halloween 1975 and 1985, Chicago newspapers ran features on local hauntings that included Mary. For example, the story Hunting a Ghost Named Mary in the Tribune on October 31st, 1985. TV news got in on the act too. On Halloween 1984, CBS Chicago ran a segment where reporter Bob Wallace went ghost hunting at Resurrection Cemetery with Dale Kaczmarek. They filmed the bent gate bars and recounted Mary's legend for the evening news, bringing her story into countless living rooms. Then came national television. In 1994, NBC's Unsolved Mysteries devoted a segment to Resurrection Mary. The show reenacted Jerry Palus's 1939 encounter, even using actual interview footage of Palus himself from 1986. They spoke with Richard Crow and others. This episode left a searing impression on viewers across the country, myself included, who first learned of Mary from the legendarily eerie voice of Robert Stack narrating her tale. The segment presented Mary's story in a sympathetic but spooky way, complete with foggy cemetery dramatizations. It undeniably sparked renewed interest and probably a few copycat reports as well. Several witnesses interviewed in the 80s and 90s admitted they'd grown up hearing the story on television or from a family member, yet never thought they'd see Mary themselves. Until they did. This illustrates an interesting feedback loop. Media exposure perpetuates the legend, which in turn generates new reports, which keep the media interested. Folklore often works this way, especially in the modern era. Every ghost special or article breathes fresh life, so to speak, into Mary, ensuring new generations learn the legend. Chicago's own cultural context also helped to sustain Resurrection Mary. The areas linked to her, Willow Springs, Justice, Archer Avenue, the old dance halls, are rich with immigrant history and spiritual traditions. Many residents historically were Catholic, Polish, Lithuanian, Irish, etc., for whom the idea of spirits and prayers for the dead are taken seriously. In such communities, a ghost story might be met with more open-mindedness, or at least curiosity. The fact that Mary is tied to a Catholic cemetery is no accident. Tales of ghosts in graveyards resonate with cultural views on restless souls and the afterlife. Additionally, Archer Avenue has long had a reputation among locals as a haunted highway. Besides Mary, there are other ghost stories along that route, including a famous tale of phantom monks near St. James Church and the haunted Chet's Melody Lounge, claiming its own resident spirits. This concentration of lore gives the whole area a mystique People driving there at night already have goosebumps, primed to possibly see something. One cannot ignore the role of business and tourism in keeping Mary's story in circulation. Ghost tourism took off in Chicago by the 1980s, with companies offering ghost tours by bus or foot. Mary was invariably the star attraction on these tours, especially the ones that ventured to the South Side. Tour guides like Crow and later companies, such as Chicago Hauntings Tours and American Ghost Walks, proudly feature Resurrection Mary on their itineraries. They know it's the crowd pleaser, the legend everyone wants to hear on a dark October night. Even Chet's Melody Lounge, the tavern across the street from Resurrection Cemetery, has leaned into the legend. As local lore has it, every Sunday the staff at Chet's mixes a Bloody Mary cocktail and leaves it at the end of the bar with an empty stool reserved, just in case Mary stops in. It's a tongue-in-cheek tribute that doubles as great publicity. Customers and ghost hunters pop in, especially around Halloween, hoping to catch a glimpse or at least share a drink with the idea of Mary. This is folklore as a living, economic phenomenon. The ghost story actually brings patrons and tourism dollars. Crucially, most who participate in these traditions know Mary's existence is unproven. The owners of Chet's or the tour guides don't claim to have hard evidence. They're trading in atmosphere and narrative, which, by the way, is the stock and trade of terrifying and true. Folklorist and author Adam Selzer, who has researched Chicago's ghosts, emphasizes that one must separate the fun of the legend from the fact. In Mary's case, he found that some supposed facts, like Mary Miskowski's death, turned out to be pure fiction. Selzer and others caution that many details get mythologized over time. For example, one recent author recounted a cabbie in the early 2000s hearing a girl say, "The snow came early this year." Clearly the same line from Bill Geist's 1979 story, just transplanted decades later. This suggests that later storytellers might simply be rehashing older anecdotes, unknowingly or not. Folklore is fluid. Stories migrate and transform. Resurrection Mary is as much a cultural phenomenon as a paranormal one. The legend has been nurtured by community storytelling, amplified by the media, and even commemorated in popular culture. In this way, Mary will likely never die, so long as people enjoy a good, spooky story. She has transcended being a mere ghost sighting to become a piece of Chicago's cultural heritage, a shared narrative that connects generations. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about how Resurrection Mary has put a dark and spooky grip on the broader popular culture and created a lasting legacy of mystery and fear. As one of America's most famous ghost legends, Resurrection Mary has unsurprisingly inspired books, films, music, and other media. Here are a few ways Mary's spectral presence has permeated popular culture, along with how the legend continues to impact the living. In literature, Mary's story anchors numerous ghost story anthologies and books, particularly about Chicago lore. Notable examples include Chicago Haunts by Ursula Bielski, 1997, which devotes a chapter to Mary, and Resurrection Mary, a Ghost Story by Keenan Heiss, 1990, which examines the legend in depth. Paranormal authors like Troy Taylor have written extensively on Mary in books and online articles, exploring both sightings and identity theories. Each retelling in print helps cement Mary's place among legendary American ghosts. Even kids' books of urban legends mention her as the vanishing hitchhiker of Illinois, ensuring the tale reaches new audiences. As far as television documentaries and dramatizations go, aside from Unsolved Mysteries, Mary appeared in a 1985 episode of Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers, a British TV series on the paranormal. That episode featured interviews with witnesses and investigators in a serious documentary style. In 2007, a public TV program called The Hauntings of Chicago devoted time to Mary's tale, including interviews with Ursula Bielski and on-site footage at Resurrection Cemetery. Countless cable TV countdowns of top hauntings on Travel Channel and the like include Resurrection Mary among their highlights. Each Halloween, local Chicago news reliably recalls the story for viewers, sometimes rerunning classic segments or updating with any new sightings. In the world of feature film, Mary's legend inspired at least 2 independent horror films in the early 2000s. One film titled simply Resurrection Mary from 2005, directed by Sean Michael Baer, presented a fictional horror plot about a group of friends encountering Mary's ghost on a road trip. The filmmakers took creative liberties, for example, portraying Mary as a vengeful spirit harming the living, which is not part of the traditional legend. Another independent project in 2005 with the same title, by Michael Lansu, also attempted to adapt the story, even filming scenes at Chet's Melody Lounge for authenticity. While these films didn't make a large splash, they show the narrative's appeal. Even if they weren't critical successes, they contribute to the cult following of the Mary mythos among horror aficionados. Additionally, Mary's story has been referenced in TV fiction. For instance, an episode of the series Supernatural in 2005 featured a vanishing hitchhiker ghost. Though not called Mary, it was clearly riffing on the archetype. So, in a sense, Mary's DNA is present in many vanishing hitchhiker tropes on screen. Even folk songs and poems sometimes arise around local legends. There have been a few lesser-known songs titled Resurrection Mary and references to her in Chicago-inspired music. One tongue-in-cheek example, musician Ian Hunter wrote a rock song called Resurrection Mary in 1995, spinning the tale of the ghost girl into lyrics, a testament to how widely the story had spread. The phrase itself, Resurrection Mary, has a kind of poetic ring that has been used in everything from bar names to a brand of beer on the South Side. The legend's imagery, a lonely road, a flowing white dress, a graveyard at night, is richly evocative and thus has permeated creative and imaginative works. In recent years, Resurrection Mary has found new life online. TikTok videos claiming to capture shadowy figures on Archer Avenue or recounting late-night drives near Resurrection Cemetery have racked up millions of views. On Reddit, particularly in r/paranormal and r/unresolved mysteries, users continue to share personal experiences or secondhand tales about the ghostly hitchhiker. While some are clear retellings of older accounts, others appear to be genuine modern sightings, or at least modern interpretations of classic ones. YouTube channels focused on urban legends have produced video essays exploring Mary's possible identities, while ghost hunting TikTokers stage late-night stakeouts at the cemetery gates. This shift shows that Mary's legend, like all good folklore, adapts to each generation's storytelling tools. In the age of digital campfires, she remains a compelling and shareable specter. Perhaps Mary's greatest impact is how strongly she's been identified with Chicago folklore. She is to Chicago what the Headless Horseman is to Sleepy Hollow, or what Bigfoot is to the Pacific Northwest. A flagship legend. The village of Justice, Illinois, where Resurrection Cemetery is located, often finds itself included in top haunted places lists because of Mary. Ghost tour buses still crawl Archer Avenue on weekends in October, their guides telling Mary's story to wide-eyed passengers as they travel past the cemetery. The now destroyed Willowbrook Ballroom site has also become a stop on tours, especially after 2016, both to mourn the loss of the venue and to honor its ghostly patroness. The anecdote of the dancing shoes left after the fire shows how deeply ingrained Mary is in local memory. The community's sadness at the ballroom's loss was intertwined with Mary's narrative, as if not only had a historic dance hall burned down, but the spiritual home of Resurrection Mary had too. Groups like the Ghost Research Society, led by Dale Kaczmarek, still keep Mary on their radar. Kaczmarek himself has collected thousands of accounts of Mary, by his estimate, and he encourages anyone who believes they've seen her to report it. While sightings have indeed dropped off since the 1980s, some credit the installation of brighter streetlights on Archer Avenue in 1985, which made ghostly apparitions much less common. The legend persists. Every so often, a story pops up on an online forum or in a local paper about a new Resurrection Mary sighting. For example, a 2005 report in a Lithuanian-language newspaper claimed Mary's ghost showed up back at the Willowbrook Ballroom, dancing with a wedding guest, then vanishing on the ride home. The ballroom staff treated it with a mix of seriousness and humor, even joking that Mary might haunt the ballroom itself, given the occasional unexplained slam of doors or flicker of lights. So, Mary has by no means been retired from ghostly duty. She still, apparently, makes her rounds now and then, or at least people still attribute strange occurrences to her. What is perhaps most enduring about Resurrection Mary is how she balances spookiness and sadness. Her story is undeniably eerie, a lone figure appearing in the dead of night, yet it's also tragic and sympathetic. She isn't portrayed as a malevolent spirit. Rather, she's seen as a lost soul, perpetually trying to get home or back to where she belongs. As Kaczmarek noted, she seems to realize at the cemetery gate that is where she belongs, and then she disappears. This image of Mary has a kind of melancholy romance to it, one that keeps people fascinated. There's even a touch of chivalry in the story, drivers trying to help a young woman in need, only to discover she was beyond help. It plays into themes of compassion, regret, and the thin veil between life and death. In the end, Resurrection Mary endures because her legend is adaptable and deeply human. It taps into the fear of the unknown on dark roads, the grief for young lives cut short, and the wonder about what lies beyond. It's a ghost story that has transcended generations, maintained by those who love to be scared, and those who simply love a good mystery. Chicago, renowned for its diverse cultural heritage, gave birth to Resurrection Mary, a figure now celebrated as one of the world's most captivating and haunting tales. On a chilly night, if you find yourself driving northeast along Archer Avenue, past Resurrection Cemetery, you might feel a prickling on the back of your neck. Perhaps you'll glance at the empty passenger seat in your car and imagine, just for a moment, a quiet young woman sitting there. The rational mind knows it's just a legend, but the power of Resurrection Mary is that she makes you wonder, what if? Tonight we've peeled back the layers of this famous ghost story. We saw how an oral legend from the 1930s evolved into a citywide phenomenon by the 1970s, buoyed by real people's testimonies and a healthy dose of media intrigue. We tracked the historical candidates, Mary Bregovy, Anna Norkus, and others, each contributing their own threads to the intricate mystery of Mary's identity. However, none of these threads emerged as the sought-after golden thread. We put the sightings under a microscope, finding plenty of consistency, but no concrete proof, reminding us that anecdote is not the same as evidence. We also acknowledge the vibrant folklore machine, the storytellers, the newspapers, the tours, the podcasts. That keeps Mary's story fresh and captivating. We've tried to be clear about where established facts end and urban legend begins. Resurrection Mary is likely an amalgam of truth and tale. There was a Mary Bregovy who died tragically in 1934, and an Anna Norkus who perished returning from a dance in 1927. Their stories undeniably fed the legend's creation. There were dozens of sober, respectable folks who swore on their honor they encountered something uncanny on Archer Avenue. We have their words, even if we can't verify their experiences from a scientific perspective. With all that being said, without doubt, Resurrection Mary has made a cultural impact, evident in everything from haunted bar stools to film scripts to faded green paint on a pair of bent cemetery gates. All of these are real, in their own way. Yet, the ghost herself, that remains a matter of personal belief. Skeptics will say Mary is just a classic urban legend, a story that grew in the telling, reinforced by coincidence and imagination. Believers will counter that there are simply too many matching reports over too long a time to dismiss, that perhaps some restless spirit truly walks Archer Avenue, even if we can't name her with certainty. We can verify the historical context and relay the eyewitness accounts, but we cannot solve the supernatural riddle. Resurrection Mary dwells in that liminal space where history and folklore intertwine. One thing is certain, however. The legend of Resurrection Mary has become a part of Chicago's identity, its story told around campfires, in tour buses, and on front porches each Halloween. It's a wink in the local bar and a shiver on the lonely road at night. In that sense, Mary is very much alive, kept alive by community memory and the enduring thrill of a spooky tale well told. So the next time you're driving past an old cemetery late at night and you spot a lone figure by the roadside, think of Resurrection Mary. You might be witnessing a piece of living folklore, or you might just be seeing things. Either way, you've become part of the story. Another driver on Archer Avenue with goosebumps, checking the rearview mirror for a vanishing girl in a white dress. And as long as those goosebumps prickle and that story is shared, Resurrection Mary will never truly die. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com, and produced by Dan Wilder, with original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.